Welcome to the Therapy and Prayer Podcast. Here you'll find the intersection between faith and mental health. I'm your host, Camille. I'm a licensed therapist and clinical social worker, but more importantly, I'm a Christian who really loves the Lord. And I'm just trying to navigate this life without falling victim to it, just like everyone else. Here we take a faith-based approach to all things mental health and wellness, because the Bible tells us to guard our heart and mind, and sometimes we need a little bit of help with that. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Therapy and Prayer Podcast. My name is Camille, I'm your host, and as always, I am just elated to have you here with me today. I hope and pray that you're doing well this week. It kind of seems like a lot of people around me are in a season, so I am praying for everyone who's going through a challenging time right now, praying for everyone who's finding it hard to stick close to God right now, and I just pray that we can find some strength and endurance. We're in this together. All right, so today we are going to be talking about boundaries. This is a highly requested episode, and it's one that I've been wanting to make for a long time, but I'm pretty sensitive to relationship issues, and I know that a lot of us struggle with boundaries. And we even really struggle with understanding what they are and the purpose of them. So we're going to talk about boundaries today, but I really want to focus on having an approach to boundaries that is maybe a little bit different than what initially comes to mind when we think of it. I think that sometimes we use the word boundaries as a cop-out or as a reason to not work through things with people, and that's not what we're here to do, and that's not what God wants us to do either. So I really want to talk about boundaries from a different perspective today, and just to give us a different kind of understanding of how they can be used as a resource to maintain relationships and to keep relationships, instead of as a way to distance people and as an excuse to cut them out of our life. So y'all know me, we love a definition around here. So a good definition for boundaries, especially when it comes to interpersonal boundaries or boundaries that exist within the context of a relationship. Boundaries define what you expect and tolerate from others and how close you allow people to get to you emotionally. Personal boundaries are the limits and rules that we set for ourselves within relationships. I like this definition a lot because it focuses on the rules that we set for ourselves. We're going to talk about this a little bit more later, but our approach to boundaries is a little bit backwards, and we put the onus on the other person to uphold our own boundaries, when really it's about the way that we choose to navigate in our own relationships in order to maintain our own mental and emotional wellness. So, given that definition, I want to talk a little bit about what boundaries are not, because I really feel like a lot of times they get misunderstood, or often we have an incorrect understanding of the way that boundaries work and of how they show up in our relationships. So, boundaries, first and foremost, are not rules for another person. I think this is what I see most often. We'll say, don't talk to me like that. Don't call me after 9 p.m. Don't do this. And we give someone else rules for the relationship. Now, I understand how that can get a little bit misconstrued, because boundaries do have to do with limits and standards and expectations, but it's not rules that someone has to comply with. So that's firstly, we're not telling someone else what to do. Boundaries are not a way to avoid dealing with conflict. This is a big one. I think that we are just very conflict averse as a people. And so when we get into a disagreement or we have a difference of opinion with someone and it feels uncomfortable for us, then we use that as an excuse to have what we may call a boundary, as a way of just not talking to that person anymore, or as a way of not talking about that thing anymore because it brings up some tension or because it brings up some uncomfortable feelings. But conflict is going to happen. It's going to come up in every relationship, but also a disagreement or a difference of opinion does not always have to lead to a conflict. And so maybe we also need to talk about how we can work through conflict and conflict resolution skills, because we're not going to be able to avoid conflict in every single relationship. And so that's not what boundaries are either. They're not a way to avoid uncomfortable conversations. The important conversations are probably always going to be uncomfortable. So if you are setting a boundary or putting a limitation into a relationship so that you won't have to address something, then that's misguided as well. And then lastly, Boundaries are not a way to try to change a person. This is another way that I've seen boundaries being abused. We don't like something in someone or we're annoyed by something in someone, and so then we use that and we'll say, "You know what? This is just a boundary of mine. I just can't be around people who smack when they eat and who eat with their mouth open. That's just a personal boundary of mine. And so if you want to be around me, then you have to stop eating with your mouth open. You have to stop because that's a boundary of mine." When really, that's a way of trying to manipulate someone and trying to change them into who you want them to be. That's not what boundaries are for either. Those are probably the primary ways that I've seen boundaries be either misunderstood, misused, abused. And I think we have to be very clear on that. We throw around the term boundaries a whole lot and we don't really know what it means. So now we talked about what boundaries are. We talked about what boundaries are not. So because we've had a misunderstanding about what they are and what they're not, I think we also sometimes get confused about the purpose of boundaries. The perspective that I think is healthiest for us, especially as Christians, is that boundaries are a way of being able to continue loving someone. I'll talk about that a little bit more later, but it's important that we understand that we have boundaries in relationships that we care about so that we can continue to pour into them in ways that are healthy for everyone involved. There are three primary components or three primary purposes that boundaries serve in our life. Number one has to do with accessibility. How much access do people have to you? How close can people get to you? How intimate are your relationships? How much access do people have to some of your vulnerabilities and some of the things that are difficult for you? Everyone is not going to have the same level of access. I heard something the other day. I think it said some people can come into your living room, and most people can come into your living room. Some people can come into your kitchen, and very few can come into your bedroom, meaning that many people have some sort of access to us, but everyone does not have that close level of access to us. And so a boundary is a tool to help us determine what kind of access it's appropriate to give people, what kind of access people can actually honor, and what kind of access people might abuse. So accessibility is the first purpose of boundaries. The second purpose of a boundary has to do with expectations. I heard a quote, I don't know where it was from, but it said that expectation is the root of all disappointment. And I have found that just to be so insanely true. We are disappointed in people when they don't meet our expectations. And so one of the reasons that boundaries are really helpful is because it helps us to adjust our expectations of someone. Oftentimes, our expectations are not rooted in the reality of who we know someone to be. Our expectations a lot of times are rooted in who we hope someone can be. They're rooted in the potential that we see in someone, where they may be rooted in who we want someone to be, but they're not always rooted in who that person is, who they have shown you to be time and time again. And so another way of using a boundary is to adjust your expectation of someone, because by adjusting your expectation, that's going to adjust the way that you interact with them. And like we said earlier, boundaries are about you and the way that you navigate in your relationships. And so sometimes we do have to adjust those expectations so that we can appropriately engage with that person. One that I see a lot is that not even that I see, but something that I know that a lot of us struggle with is that we will expect people to be just like us. You cannot expect yourself from someone else. So you can't expect someone to be the same type of friend that you are, the same type of sibling, the same type of parent, the same type of spouse. You can't expect that of everyone else. And so a lot of times we will project onto other people the kind of friend that we are, or the kind of friend that we try to be, or the kind of friend that we want. And we'll project it onto somebody, even if they have really never shown evidence that they can rise to that standard. Then you end up hurting your own feelings when you do that. So if I am, I don't know, I'm every time I go to the store, I buy your favorite candy, or I give lots of gifts. And so I'm always giving you things, but then you don't give me random gifts. And so then I feel like you don't value me as much as I value you, because you are not giving me lots of gifts when I give you lots of gifts. That is not a realistic expectation. If that person has never been a gift giver, why would I expect them to all of a sudden be a gift giver? I can't expect everyone to be the same type of listener as I am. I can't expect everyone to be maybe as intuitive as I am. Or here's one that we say a lot: we cannot expect people, number one, to automatically know when something's wrong with us or when we need something if we have not communicated that need to them. We'll say, well, they should know that I wasn't as happy as I was as I usually am, or I wasn't as perky as I usually am, or I didn't laugh at their jokes, and so that should have been a clue to them that something's wrong with me. We want people to read our minds. When we can't read nobody's, I can't read nobody's mind. But we want people to read our minds because we feel like it's easier if someone just offers help and support. That way we don't have to ask for it, because we have a hard time asking for help, asking for support. Almost everyone that I have worked with who has dealt with anxiety on some level, this comes up. Not wanting to ask for support, feeling like a burden to someone else for wanting to ask. And so then we develop this expectation that we shouldn't have to ask and that the other person should just have to know, because that takes the responsibility off of us. But today we're talking about accountability. We're talking about taking accountability in our relationships. And that also extends to whether or not we are communicating to other people what we need. Communicating boundaries is about communicating needs. So whether this be a way that you need someone to interact with you in order to be like healthy and safe for you, or whether it be communicating to someone that you're having a hard day and you just need someone to listen to, or communicating that you need a ride somewhere, or that you need help with a project, whatever it is, we really have to do better about communicating within our relationships in general. Like, you got to open your mouth. I know we talked about communication a couple of weeks ago, but generally speaking, we do not communicate the things that we probably need to communicate to other people. We hold back so much in our relationships. We hold back so much from our loved ones. We hold back the things that we need, but we expect them to anticipate and know our needs. We expect them to meet our needs without us ever telling them what they are. How does that make sense? So as we talk some more about boundaries, let's get that truth deep in our spirit, that we really have to do a better job of communicating our needs in our relationships to our loved ones. Talking to myself here as well. We owe that to ourselves, and we owe that to the people that we love. How else are we going to be able to be there for one another? And we know how important it is to have a sense of community and to have trusted, safe people. But we cannot be good to one another if we don't know what one another needs. And we're not going to know what one another needs unless we start telling each other what we need. Okay, so we were talking about expectations not being a mind reader. Okay, that's how we got there. The third thing, and this is probably the biggest one. Boundaries are about safety. Boundaries are about safety in relationships, whether physical, mental, emotional, spiritual. Boundaries are about safety. These are things that we need to put in place in order to maintain our safety within the context of a relationship. What do I mean by that? When we talk about mental, emotional, spiritual safety, we're talking about things that can threaten your wellness in any of those ways. Anything that can threaten your wellness, your health in any way is unsafe. So physical safety, that one's pretty self-explanatory. If you are in some sort of relationship with someone who is physically violent, then we need to have some boundaries there. Absolutely. We probably need to evaluate whether or not that's a good relationship to be in, which is something separate from having boundaries. We probably should evaluate that. But at the very least, we need to have some sort of boundaries. If something is unsafe for you mentally, then maybe there's a lot of manipulation going on. Maybe there's a lot of control happening. Maybe there's a lot of passive aggressive communication, and maybe it is messing with your mental health. Maybe it's making you more anxious. Maybe it's making you depressed. Maybe it's it's making it difficult for you to be focused. If something is unsafe for you emotionally, then maybe that relationship is really triggering for you, or reminds you of a past painful experience, or maybe you're like incredibly empathetic, and if that person has a lot of drama and you get pulled into it very easily, then that can be emotionally draining for you. And then if something is not safe for you spiritually, what that means, at least to me, is that this thing or this relationship can lead you into sin. This thing can potentially threaten your spiritual wellness or your right standing with God, your relationship with Him. Is this relationship emotionally safe? We hear this verse a lot about being equally yoked, and this is what it's talking to. That verse is not just about marriage and romantic relationships. It's talking about anyone that you are in a relationship with. So a yoke, if you don't know, a yoke, we're not talking about egg yolk, but a yoke is a piece of wood that holds two animals together. Usually it was used for oxen, so that they could work together and so that they could be more effective and pull a heavier load together, because two are stronger than one. And if the oxen were not equally yoked, if one was stronger or weaker than the other, then that would actually slow the process down instead of moving it forward. So that's really good when we're talking about relationships, because when you're in a relationship with someone, there is some sort of commonality or some sort of common goal. There's something that we are both working towards individually that we have in common, or we're working towards the same common goal together. But there is some sort of common ground there. There's a foundation that this relationship is built on. And if that foundation is not compatible with one another, then that relationship could potentially cause more harm than good, especially spiritually. So boundaries are about making sure that you can still be safe while you love someone else, so that you can still be safe while you show up in this relationship. Now that safety is twofold. Firstly, usually when we think about boundaries, we think about ourselves, right, and what we need in protecting ourselves, and that is absolutely a part of it. But in a larger sense, the purpose of a boundary is to protect the relationship. And this is the part that I really want us to focus on, because we know that we're not here to do life alone. We're not meant to be alone. We're just not. That's why God created Eve for Adam, because we're not meant to be alone. And so we need things in place to protect our relationships. And this is where the boundary comes into play. Essentially, the question is, what needs to shift in our relationship in order for us to be able to keep loving one another well? Because we want to keep loving one another well. What do I need to change about my interaction with you in order to keep loving you well? What might you need to change about your interaction with me in order to keep loving me well? Everyone has their own boundaries. They're not going to be the same. They're not going to be the same. And this is why a boundary is not a rule, because it's not really, it doesn't necessarily apply in the same way to everybody, right? A rule for the relationship is, I don't know, don't go to bed angry, right? Or a rule is that we watch Bridgerton together. Don't watch it without me. Like, that's a rule. But a boundary is going to be maybe different for different people in the relationship. It's not one size fits all. But the purpose is so that we can continue loving one another well. There are things that happen in relationships sometimes that can harden our heart and that can make it difficult for us to continue showing love to one another. And that context has really helped me to embrace the concept of boundaries in a new way. Now, the other purpose of boundaries, and this is the one that we usually think about, is the self-protection. And that's the part of it that maybe focuses more on our carnal side, on our ego, on protecting our feelings, not wanting to get our feelings hurt. And this is a big one. And this came up as well when we talked about forgiveness a while ago. But we don't want to get our feelings hurt. And so we have these things in place to try to avoid getting our feelings hurt, but that's not really all the way avoidable. So if you're only concerned about having boundaries for yourself, if the only concern is to make sure that you don't get hurt, then I think that you need to have some reevaluating to do. When your boundaries are only about you, then you're saying, I want to make sure that I don't get hurt in this relationship. I want to make sure that I get what I need and that it's comfortable for me, right? When it's centered around you. When it is centered around us, when it's for the common good, when it's centered around the relationship, those things are going to be a little bit different. The things that we think about and the questions that we ask. Instead of saying, why did you hurt me? What I'm going to be asking is, what is hurt in you that is causing you to treat me this way, or that's causing you to behave this way with me? What's going on inside of you? Or what is it in you that is having some sort of negative response to something in me? What is it that is causing this barrier in our relationship? And how can we navigate and maneuver around that thing? Or can we work with this thing or through this thing so that we can continue to love each other better? Do y'all see that different approach? When we center the relationship, then that's going to change the type of boundaries that we have. That's going to change maybe how many boundaries we have or how rigid they are when we center the relationship instead of only centering ourselves. Boundaries ought to be about both people, I think, instead of just one. The goal is to be able to show more love and not less. When you are in a relationship with someone and there are no boundaries or poor boundaries and everyone's just doing what they want and you feel like you can't say anything about how you feel, or you feel like you can never say no, that's going to do something to you. That's going to do something to you. And that's going to come out in the way that you treat this person, in the way that you talk to this person, in the way that you think about, in the way that you think about this person. You may start to avoid this person altogether. It's going to make it hard for you to love them. If you have a friend who their sense of humor is in like making jokes about you all the time, or like roasting you all the time, and that's not really, you don't really like that, but you don't know what to say about it, then that's going to do something in you. That's going to make it so that you feel like you have to be like super on edge or working on eggshells whenever you're around them, because they're going to try to find something to make fun of you about. You're going to feel like you can't be your most authentic self. Maybe you feel like you can't share things with this person because they're just going to make fun of you for it, because that's the way that they joke, is by making fun. And so maybe you stop coming around altogether. Now, how might it be different if you were to share that those kind of jokes affect me in this way? And so in order for me to be able to keep showing up in this relationship in a genuine and authentic way, in order for me to be able to keep loving you in a way that I think is pleasing to God, I'm going to need us to adjust some of those jokes, or I'm going to request that we make those jokes a little bit less, or that we find a different way to laugh together, because in that way only one of us is laughing, and that's not really working for me. Now, let me also say this. People are not obligated to respect your boundaries. We need to really receive that. People are not obligated to respect your boundaries. That friend could very easily say, no, I think I'm going to continue making those jokes. And they have every right to. They have every right to. We're not really helping anything when we fight somebody over our boundaries. When we're like, no, well, you have to. They absolutely don't have to. They don't. Just like you don't have to continue allowing them that level of access to you if they are not committed to trying to make this relationship a safe place for you to be. And that's exactly what that is. If you say to someone, hey, when you make those kind of jokes, it actually kind of hurts my feelings and it brings up some insecurities for me. And I'm not really having a good time when we're doing that. It kind of puts me on edge. And I just want us to be able to laugh and joke and have a good time together. And it makes it hard for me to do that when you're always making those jokes and making fun of me. Someone who loves you is going to hear that. And they are going to really take that into consideration. They're going to probably take some accountability or apologize and say, oh, I had no idea. I never want to make you feel that way. Someone who truly loves you and is committed to having a quality relationship with you is going to take that feedback and they're going to adjust their behavior based on that. Now, if someone does not take that feedback and adjust their behavior, then that tells you a lot about the quality and the safety that exists in that relationship. And now we probably have some other things that we need to evaluate about that relationship in general. But people are not obligated. They do not have to respect your boundaries, which is why it's about us and not them. I think when we put the responsibility on other people to uphold and respect our boundaries, then they're less stable. They're less stable. So if we're like, you know what, I really don't like those kind of jokes. I don't make those kind of jokes, and I don't uh like I don't really engage with like self-deprecating humor. Okay, so that's you talking about what you're gonna do. Instead of saying, please don't make those jokes. I don't like it when you make those jokes. Stop making those jokes. And then if they keep doing it, then you're like, "Ugh, they just don't listen. They're just not respecting my boundaries." But then you keep showing up. When you put the responsibility on you and you say, I don't engage in that kind of humor, I don't really participate. I'm not going to feel like I have to laugh just to like, not kill the vibe or to fit in. And if that continues to happen, I'm going to either like remove myself from the conversation. I'm going to get up from the table because I'm holding myself accountable to the boundary that I have set for myself instead of expecting someone else to do it. Other people are not obligated to respect your boundaries. Similarly, we have an option about whether or not we want to respect God's boundaries. God's boundary being if you are engaging in sin, then you can't be close to Him. You can't have the same kind of access to Him if you're engaging in sin. He gives us all free will. He gives us all free will. We can either say, you know what, God, yes, I'm going to try my very best because I want to be close to you, or we're going to say, no, I like it over here. Okay, cool. Then you don't have the same kind of access to God anymore while you're living in sin. Same thing. We all have free will. So do the people in our lives. So they're not obligated to uphold your boundaries. No one is going to be as concerned with your boundaries as you are because everyone has their own that they're thinking about, or they should have their own that they're thinking about. So if let's say if someone uses like, I don't know, this is the example I give a lot. If someone uses aggressive language, they're always yelling, screaming, and cussing at you. And if you try to say, please don't speak to me that way, that is my boundary. Don't speak to me that way. Cool. Sure. Fair enough, I guess, if someone decides that they are going to prioritize that as well. That's different from saying, I do not engage with aggressive language. I do not have conversations that involve aggressive language. That's a standard that you're setting for yourself. Now, with the first one, the next time that person uses aggressive language with you, then internally you're going to be like, oh man, I asked them not to, but they're still okay. And you're going to still like fall into that same kind of pattern. And you're going to still try to get your point across. You're going to still try to communicate with that language. But when you say, I don't have conversations that have aggressive language, then you're only accountable to yourself. Because with the first example, you can say, well, they didn't respect my boundaries. And so that's how we got into another argument because they didn't respect my boundaries. We're putting the responsibility on someone else when the responsibility is on you. If that person starts to have aggressive language, remember that your boundary is, I do not have conversations with aggressive language. I do not engage with aggressive language. That's your boundary. So when someone starts to yell and scream and cuss at you, you are removing yourself. You're not engaging with it, whatever that looks like. If that means that you just stop speaking and let them get it all out, and then you end the conversation, if that means that you get off of the phone, if that means that you walk away, if that means that you start talking to someone else instead, you are only responsible to yourself. So then if you remain in that and you engage in that aggressive language, you betrayed your own boundary. No one else did that. And you can't put it on anyone else. It needs to be on you. So a healthy approach to boundaries is thinking about ways that you are willing to engage in your own relationships, thinking about standards that you have for yourself, right? I can't communicate with someone who uses aggressive language. I don't really partake in self-deprecating humor or in like lots of roasting back and forth. I don't debate about things that I don't care about. Like I don't debate for fun, right? What are the standards that you have for yourself in relationships so that you can continue loving the other person well? Now, those standards and those boundaries ought to be based on what you need in order to be safe in that relationship. Because if you are unsafe, then your priority changes and now you're in survival mode, right? And now I'm not in a place where I'm trying to show you as much love as I can because I'm just trying to protect myself. We want to eliminate that. We want to eliminate that as much as possible. And so maybe that means adjusting the level of access that someone has to you, right? Maybe when you were closer to me, when you were very close to me, and I needed someone to talk to, and there were just, multiple times where you weren't able to meet my needs after I've expressed them, let me say that, where you weren't able to meet those needs, then I'm not going to expect you. I'm no longer going to expect you to meet those needs, which also means that you don't have the same level of access to me because you no longer are privy to my emotional needs because I've stopped sharing them with you because your behavior has shown that you're maybe not capable of meeting those emotional needs. That does not mean that you don't love me. It doesn't mean that I don't love you. It means that you're not able to meet these needs. So I'm going to stop expecting you to meet these needs. Do we kind of see how that works? And so now that becomes a bit of a boundary. You are not as close to me because you're not aware of my emotional needs because I don't necessarily share those with you anymore. Because based on the behavior that I've seen from you, based on who you have shown yourself to be, it would not be fair for either of us for me to expect you to be able to show up in this way when you have not been able to do it. So that's how we form boundaries in relationships, based on who we know people are, based on the expectations that are more realistic and not expectations that are rooted in hope. And I'm adjusting those expectations in order to protect my own wellness. Because if I keep expecting you to show up in a way that you've shown you're not capable of showing up in, I'm going to keep hurting myself in the process. So for my own personal safety and so that I can continue loving you well, I'm going to adjust these expectations and I'm going to have a new boundary now in that relationship. So now maybe my expectation is not that you're going to meet my emotional needs, but my expectation is that we're always going to have a good time when we get together. My expectation is that when I have an event, you're going to show up. My expectation is that we're going to be able to talk about the shows and movies and music that we have in common, that we like together. That's my expectation because you've shown that you can meet that expectation. What I often tell people, and like how do I know, right? Like what category to put someone in, like whether or not I should let them be close to me or not. Think about the qualifications that you have for someone that maybe you would consider a best friend in comparison to the qualification that you would have for someone that you would just consider a friend versus an acquaintance, right? What are the maybe qualifications or expectations that you would have for someone in each of those categories? And then you just watch, you just observe, you let people be who they naturally are and see which qualifications are they naturally meeting. Are they naturally meeting the qualifications for an associate? Meaning when you see them, we always have something kind to say and we're happy to see each other, but we don't talk in between times of seeing each other in person and we don't really miss each other and there's no bad blood. Maybe I'll still send you a birthday text. And if there is like a big significant event, or maybe we run in like similar circles. I don't know. And so maybe that's the qualifications that person is already meeting, right? If that's organically the way that relationship is unfolding, then maybe that's where you ought to put them. And those are the expectations that you have of them. If you and that person do tend to talk more in between, but let's say like a lot of the talking is like via social media. Maybe sometimes we'll text about something or we're in a couple of group chats together. Then maybe you might consider that person a friend, right? Or maybe like we send TikToks back and forth, and so maybe you might consider that person a friend or a close acquaintance or whatever it is. You catch my drift, but see where people naturally fall in your life. And if you can base your expectations on where people naturally fall into your life, then I think that it will be easier to have some mutual boundaries for one another, mutual boundaries within that relationship. And that's going to be a safe relationship for you because the expectations of that person are based on who you already know them to be, not on who you want them to be. You feel safe with them, with having this level of access to you. Right? And sure, relationships can change and grow over time. And so maybe there will come a time where they have more access to you. And maybe you feel safe with that too. But there's also an element of self-reflection and being able to tap in with yourself and know what makes you feel safe or unsafe with someone. so that that can inform the boundaries, the necessary boundaries in that relationship. So, what do I need in order to stay safe, in order to continue loving them? Does that mean that you need to be really aware of what your triggers are and what it takes to manage them? And if there's someone who maybe is still friends with your ex, then hey, sorry, girl, we're not going to be able to be close because maybe that's still triggering for me, right? Maybe so. Or if I don't know, someone works at a place that you used to work at but was very toxic for you, and that brings up some nasty memories and some negative feelings, then maybe we need to have some boundaries there. Maybe we don't talk about work. Maybe it's that. Maybe we just don't talk about work, right? Or if you are recently divorced and this person is going through a divorce, or on the opposite end, if you went through a divorce and this person is getting married and maybe that's bringing up a little bit of hateration in you, then okay, maybe we need to have some boundaries here so I can keep loving you well. But it's always going to come back to that. Especially as Christians, we are supposed to love everyone because God loved everyone. Jesus loved everyone. He gave everyone some level of access to him, but everyone did not have the same level of access to Jesus. He had 12 disciples and he had 3 besties, okay? He had a group of people that was with him, and within that group, he had like a core group, those people who saw him in his more vulnerable moments, but everyone had access to him. When he was walking through crowds and people needed something, then they had access to him, right? Maybe people had to wait until he finished doing something, or they had to like ask, but everyone had some sort of access to him, but everyone did not have the same level of access to him. And Jesus actually had a lot of boundaries. And as I was preparing for this episode, I came across an outline that comes from a book. What was the name of that book? It's in my Amazon cart. I haven't gotten it yet, but it was actually really helpful, because usually when we think about boundaries and about Jesus having boundaries, we're like, well, yeah, he went and he prayed alone. He went to the garden and prayed alone. He did, but there was also a lot of other things that he did, because boundaries are not just about saying no, or they're not just about like still having your alone time. They're much more involved and more thorough than that. So I was really grateful to find this resource that talked about a lot of the different ways that Jesus had boundaries while he was here on earth. Okay, the book is called Your Best Life in Jesus' Easy Yoke. I haven't read it yet, so this is not a full recommendation, but it gave some really good examples, and a pretty good outline too of studying the examples of Jesus setting boundaries. But a few of those is that Jesus always had a like relaxed disposition. He was never burned out, which is kind of crazy to think about because of how self-sacrificing he was and because of how much he did and how focused he was on his mission. Those of us who are workaholics, or who can be workaholics sometimes, you know that you're going to burn out eventually. Like, you only have so much fuse. He didn't burn out. And remember that he was fully human, right? It wasn't because he was using his supernatural abilities to not burn out, but it was because he took care of himself still and prioritized his needs. It was because he also was not a people pleaser, which meant that he knew how to say no. He did say no. Jesus did not do everything that everyone asked of him at all. Look at when the devil was tempting him in the wilderness and he said no to all those things. Hello? So he said no, he was not a people pleaser, which probably helped him to maintain some of his peace. So he had a relaxed disposition all the time. He didn't take on other people's urgency as his own. I'm thinking about the story of Lazarus when he raised Lazarus from the dead. When Lazarus' sisters reached out and sent word to Jesus that Lazarus was sick and that he was dying, he was somewhere else. And he could have said, oh no, I have to hurry up and get there because he's going to die and his sisters are going to be so upset. And he did not do that. He finished what he was doing. He waited a day and then he went to see about him. Lazarus was his friend and someone that he loved. And when he got there and saw that he was dead, he mourned with his sisters. And yes, he knew that he was going to raise him from the dead, but he did not rush back from what he was doing in order to do what he knew he was going to do. Whether he had gotten there a day earlier or a day later, he was always going to revive Lazarus. He was always going to do that. So he did not take on someone else's urgency as his own. And I think a lot of us can take a page from that book. We take on so much urgency. I'm in a space where I'm really trying to embrace a level of ease with things. And that means being okay with slowing down. I was traveling, and I was at the airport, and I like had to take out my ID, right, to show the TSA person. And usually I would like just hurry up and stuff it somewhere real quick to like get through the line, not slow anything down. And I was like, Camille, put your ID back in your wallet and then put your wallet back in your bag. This is going to take maybe an extra 6 seconds. And these people have 6 seconds. It wasn't even a long line behind me. It wasn't even full. But that inclination that I have to always be rushing, to never inconvenience anyone, even for a few seconds, that's a lot to carry. Jesus did not have that. Now, I'm still working on it because when I was getting off of the airplane and I got my carry-on down and I had my backpack, I didn't like take the couple extra seconds to like put my backpack on the handle because it had the little strap on the back to like put it on the handle because that would have taken another couple of seconds. But you know, when them folk trying to get off the plane, everybody's trying to hurry up. And I feel like we just don't have that kind of time. So I'm still working on it. But he was always laid back in what he did. He walked everywhere, which means that he could only move so fast anyway. But Jesus didn't burn out. He was not a people pleaser. He was more focused on pleasing God than on pleasing man anyway. And that's also what we should be doing. When we're so focused on pleasing other people, then we don't have very strong boundaries because we are so easily swayed by what we think someone else is going to think or feel, how they're going to perceive us, and the way that we interact is based on them. It's based on what they think and what they want and what they need and what they feel. Jesus was only concerned with pleasing God. He wasn't really concerned with pleasing anyone else. And he was very pleasing to God. And so if we look at the way he lived his life, and his life was extremely pleasing to God, then we can learn a lot from his interactions with people. The ways that he interacted with people, the ways that he didn't interact with people, the ways that he refused to interact with people. Those Pharisees were always trying to bait Jesus. They were always trying to bait him and trying to trip him up on something. And he never gave into it. He never gave into it, and he always handled it with grace. And he was never hateful towards them. He was still loving towards them, but he wasn't going for it at all. Okay. He refused to engage in inappropriate behavior. He corrected other people, and he always did it with love, which goes back to what we said earlier about having some tension in relationships and maybe having some disagreements. Sometimes we have to hold one another accountable. Sometimes we have to give some challenging and difficult feedback. We can do that while still showing love. He offered grace and truth to those who needed it. Jesus was meeting needs, not wants. I think that's a big one for us. We have a hard time saying no. But if we were to prioritize what people needed instead of what people wanted, I think that we might have an easier time with it. And there are, of course, some creative ways that we can say no without it feeling so harsh, because I do understand that comes with a certain connotation. And so we don't always just want to say no. Okay. Okay, sure, I get it. That can sound a little bit harsh. But we also don't always have to say yes. And we do not have to overextend ourselves in order to do what someone else wants us to do, in order to do what is going to be good for someone else and not good for us. The only time that Jesus really overextended himself like that was when he went on the cross. But was it really an overextension, or was it just completing his assignment? Beyond that, he held himself to a high personal standard. He held himself to a high godly standard. He was not going to do anything that was going to threaten his relationship with God or was going to take him out of good standing with God. And he prioritized his wellness. We know that he slept. We know that he ate. We know that he took time away from other people. We know that he always had time for prayer. Jesus prioritized his wellness. Okay, his self-care was on point, and that was a part of his boundary. I can still meet the needs of other people while meeting my own. And I cannot meet the needs of other people if I do not meet my own. So we really have a lot of good examples of Jesus setting boundaries that are not just about saying no. They're not just about having your quiet time, and they're not about keeping people away. They're about being able to still love people. So that's actually a really good example of how we want to make sure that we're centering the relationship when we're thinking about what boundaries we need and we're thinking about healthy and necessary boundaries. Necessary is a key word here. Is it necessary to have this boundary, or is this something that we probably just need to kind of talk about? I think we have a hard time like laboring with one another. I was listening to a sermon about Judas. Well, not about Judas, but in the sermon we were talking about Judas and how when Jesus was with his disciples and he said, one of you is going to betray me. And he knew that it was Judas who was going to betray me, that he knew that it was Judas who was going to betray him. And so at that gathering, he told Judas, you're going to betray me. He knew that Judas was going to betray him and he still broke bread with him. Excuse me? He still broke bread, even though he knew that Judas was not only capable of hurting him, but that Judas was going to hurt him. Now, I don't necessarily know all of the why behind that, but I think it has to do with knowing someone's heart. And that's not to say that Judas was pure in heart, and so that's why Jesus still loved him. But I think that when we have people who are close to us, then sometimes we know how they might be affected by certain things. Sometimes we know the type of temptation that is probably going to trip them up. And sometimes their temptation tripping them up might be hurtful to us. Now, if I know that the only reason that this hurtful thing was done and that I was a victim of this hurtful thing, if I know the only reason is because you're really struggling with this temptation and with this particular sin, would it be loving of me to then say, you know what? I think that we need to put some distance here. No. And I know that some of y'all not going to like this. I know that y'all not going to like this. But that's the example that Jesus gave. If I know that you are struggling with this temptation and that when you fall to that temptation, it can have some negative effects on the people around you, at that point, I of course have a choice. But if I want to continue loving you well, then at that point, maybe we need to think about forgiveness. Can I forgive someone for falling to temptation? I know I fall to temptation sometimes, and sometimes that could have an effect on the people around me. When we think about forgiveness, we need to think about the person's heart, especially if they're taking accountability and apologizing and asking for forgiveness. But even when they're not, go back and listen to the episode that I did on forgiveness a while ago. And we kind of touched on some of this. But even when people are not necessarily apologizing, but you know that they're struggling with this thing, what's the more loving thing to do in that instance and in that moment? I think that's what Jesus was showing us with Judas. And later we see that Judas was extremely remorseful eventually for what he did, extremely, because he still had love for Jesus. He still loved Jesus, even though he did this like horrific thing. And we do that to God all of the time. But when we're thinking about boundaries, and that's why earlier when I was talking about centering the relationship and a part of the question being, what is it that's hurt in you that's causing you to act this way towards me? What is it that you're struggling with that's causing you to speak to me this way? What is it that you're struggling with that's causing you to be dishonest with me about this thing? What is it? Right? And if we can really see one another and prioritize one another's needs in that way, then I think it's easier for us to be forgiving. And we're not so quick to just like shoot up a boundary as a wall and like a defense mechanism so that we never get hurt again. There is no way to guarantee that you never get hurt again. You are going to get hurt again, whether it be in this relationship or in another one. That is going to happen. We are going to get hurt and we are going to hurt people. That's just the nature of the game. We're humans, we're people. So there's always going to be hurt. You're not going to be able to avoid that. And if we can see that someone else is hurting and that's why they hurt us, then I think that that's a really good opportunity for us to look more like Christ. Now, I'm not saying that we just need to completely be doormats. But I think that there's a difference between someone who is not actually working through something or struggling with something, and who is not actually um, trying to get better and bring that thing to God and petition for Him to heal that in them. I think there's a difference between someone who is blatantly taking advantage because they know that you're going to say yes, versus someone who is struggling with something, and because they're struggling with this thing, they can be hurtful to other people at times. I think that those are two different things. Again, y'all ain't gonna like this. You don't have to. You don't have to. That's okay. But when there's clear manipulation, manipulation does not come from a loving place. That does not come from a place of someone who is maybe struggling with a certain temptation. I think that that comes from an evil place. That comes from a malicious place. I think that that is a different kind of category of relationship and of people, because now we're talking about abuse and people who are hurting you on purpose because they get something from it or because they want to. If that's what's happening, then yeah, there needs to, at the very least, be some boundaries. And maybe we need to think about whether or not that's a relationship that we ought to keep. Now, there probably is an argument to say, like, well, if someone is very manipulative, they probably are struggling with something. Maybe they're manipulative because they had a lot of hurt and abuse and trauma in their relationships, and this is the way that they learned to cope, and yada, yada, yada. Okay, maybe so. Maybe so. What are you doing to try to heal that? Are you even aware and acknowledging the fact that you are being manipulating, or are you in denial about it? Because if you're in denial about it, and if you're not even able to acknowledge the fact that what you're doing is hurtful, but you keep just making excuses and you keep playing the victim, not taking any kind of accountability, then I think that maybe I want to limit the access that you have to me. I probably. I'm going to pray for you through that. I'm going to pray that you get some help and some healing for those scars that are causing you to act this way and that's causing you to push people away. And maybe that's your own type of self-sabotage. And we all have our own type. I'm going to pray for you and find a way to love you from over here, because that's not safe for me. That's not safe for me. Maybe that's leading me to sin. That's hardening my heart, right? Now, if I know, let's say that maybe you're struggling with, I don't know, addiction, alcoholism, right? And when you drink too much, then you say some hurtful things. But I know that you've been struggling with it and that you've really been trying to work through it. And let's say that there comes a day where you drink too much and you say some things to me that you probably wouldn't say when you're sober. And I know that. While those things maybe were still hurtful, if I know that you've been struggling with this addiction, that you've been actively trying to work through it, and that you had a day where the temptation presented itself and that you were not able to or that you weren't strong enough in that moment, and so you felt a temptation, whatever it is, yeah, that did still hurt my feelings, and I forgive you. Or at least I hope and would like to say that I would be able to forgive you because of those things. But I think that we're really quick to put distance in a relationship anytime something uncomfortable or hurtful happens. You know what? This is, even as I'm saying it, like I think that I've bought in to a bit of the of our culture's conditioning, because I'm like, well, yeah, like, why say somewhere where you're being hurt? And I think that this is the balance that we need to find and that we struggle with a lot, because hurtful things are going to happen. Um, and remember we talked about intent versus impact. When we go back and listen to the communication episode, we talked about intent versus impact. This is another example of intent versus impact. This is an example of a time where I am choosing to forgive the impact based on my knowledge of the intention. Usually it's the other way around. It's like, well, listen, even if you didn't intend it that way, that was very hurtful. And so you need to be more careful with what you say because that was hurtful. Sometimes that is the case. But I also think that there are cases where the intention can justify forgiving the impact. I do. Y'all not gonna like this one. Y'all are not gonna like this one. I just really think that we need to do a better job of laboring with one another. If you're struggling with addiction and you said something that was hurtful to me, then maybe that's going to motivate me to like try to help you through this even more so that these hurtful things don't keep happening. Or because like the next day when you sobered up, like you were so remorseful and you felt so bad about it. And I don't like seeing you like that. Like whatever it is, but we need to be able to labor with one another a little bit more. Or maybe we've gone through something together, or there was some sort of like rift in our relationship, and we just haven't really found our way back to one another. And so now we become more distant and we've never really talked about it. Like we got to be able to work through some things together. I do think that because of our culture of instant gratification and the self-centeredness in a lot of our relationships, that we are so quick to want to end relationships with people. People talking about my cutoff game is so strong. Why is that something that we're proud of when we are here to be fishers of men, when we are here to love one another, when we're here to show the love of God and He loves everyone? Everyone. If God can still love you, then I need to try my very best to still love you. We're so quick to cut people off. That was not the plan, and that was not the intention. I also don't think that the plan or intention was for us to be abused and manipulated in relationships. Again, going back to Jesus and that example, when folks was trying to manipulate him, he wasn't having it. He was not going for it. So that's not what I'm saying either. I want to be very clear about that because I think that this could be a slippery slope. And that people use this type of logic to justify staying in unhealthy relationships or to justify not having boundaries where there really does need to be some. So we really need to pray for discernment and for wisdom so that God can help us to know when a boundary is necessary and what's going to be a healthy and effective one. And so that He can show us maybe when there is a relationship that we need to reevaluate or maybe that we need to leave. So we need God's help with this. We need His help with our boundaries like we need His help with everything else. Okay, let's move on. That's going to bring us to our scripture of the day. Let's dive into the word, see what it has to say about some of this. Our scripture today is coming from Luke chapter 5, verse 15 and 16. It says, "Yet the news about him spread all the more, so that crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed." I like this verse because it talks about how much people wanted from Jesus and how much was being asked of him. People traveled far and wide to come and hear him and to come and get healed from him. People always wanted something from Jesus. There wasn't a time where nobody wanted anything from him. And while he was meeting needs and while he was a servant, he did not do that at his own expense. He did not do that at the expense of his own well-being till he went to the cross. That's always going to be the caveat. But he did not serve others to his own detriment. The latter part of this passage says, "But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed." That "but" is important, saying people came to him and they asked of him and they wanted him to heal him. He heard all that. However, there were times where he would often withdraw and go to places alone and pray. What that tells me is there may have been times where he withdrew alone and prayed, maybe instead of doing what someone else was asking him to do. I never even really thought about it like that. But that's what that "but" says. That means like, however, there were times when people came and wanted things from Jesus and he either said no, or where instead of doing what someone else wanted, he did what was healthy and good and necessary for him. We know that he did so many miracles and he did so much for people. So saying no and not being able to always say yes did not take away from the impact that he was able to have in people's lives. Not always being able to say yes did not make Jesus any less important, any less valuable. Prioritizing his needs did not take away from anyone else's. I think a lot of us need to hear that. We really have this all or nothing thinking. Either your wants or mine, either your needs or mine. Not so, not the case. This is a good example of how sometimes Jesus had to prioritize what he needed for himself, and he was meeting the needs of other people. Setting boundaries is not mean or selfish. It's a part of your self-care because no one is going to prioritize your boundaries like you are. All right, so wrapping up, that's going to bring us to our question of the day. Just as a reminder, if you have a question that you want answered on the show, please feel free to send me an email at therapyandprayer@gmail.com, or you can leave a comment wherever you're listening or watching to this or anywhere on social media at Therapy and Prayer. Okay, today's question says, I grew up in a family where love was conditional based on doing what the other person wants, and as a result, I became a people pleaser. Because I'm used to seeing love as do this or else you don't love me, do this or else I won't love you, I'm struggling with knowing what it feels like to be loved by God in an unconditional way. I can understand it logically, but not on an emotional and spiritual level. How would I be able to know or feel God's love despite how I was raised? How did you come to trust and feel God's unconditional love? I love this question. Maybe because of my my people-pleasing history. But I think that a lot of us can probably share this experience. And we know that we tend to interact with God through the lens of our personal relationships. And so if you have had a lot of personal relationships where you have felt pressure to do what the other person wanted, or where those relationships felt really conditional, then that's how you're going to interact with God and assume that he interacts with us. When I read this question, the first thing that came to mind is the whole concept of like knowing something logically but not feeling it emotionally. Sometimes we have to let the logic lead. So when it comes to like our faith and our belief, right? There are times when I know and I believe this thing, even though like emotionally I'm not really feeling it. I know that God is always with me, even though there might be times where it doesn't really feel that way. And so this is one of those times where our emotions and our feelings are maybe not always the best indicator of what is true. And this is a good example, I think, of how the enemy can use our feelings and our emotions against us. So my initial answer is choose to believe that God loves you unconditionally, even if you don't feel it, and then look for evidence of it. Choose to believe that he loves you and then look for the evidence of it. Look for God in everything and you will always find him. I'm a firm believer of that. If you look for God in everything, you'll always find him. Also, and actually this is probably first, look to the cross. Look to the cross because God sent his son to die for you before you even committed your first sin, because he always wanted you to be able to access him. He never wanted a day to go by where you were not able to be close to him. That is unconditional love. He did that before you committed your first sin, knowing that you were going to commit many sins. And he never wanted there to be a time where you would not be able to access him, which is why he sent his son. I don't know any love that is greater or more unconditional than that. When I really started to understand more about what happened at the cross, that's when I started to feel God's unconditional love for me. And I have been hearing about what happened at the cross my whole entire life. I've been hearing about the cross and the crucifixion and the resurrection my whole life. But not until I really started thinking about and studying the implications of what was done, the intentionality behind what was done and how it was done and the purpose of it. Ooh, even just talking about it now, that makes me feel so loved, so loved. There is nothing that I could have done to earn or deserve the way that God loves me, the way that he loved me before I existed. The Bible says that he knew me in my mother's womb. He formed me in my mother's womb. He took so much There was so much intentionality that has gone into your very being, into your creation. He knows every single strand of hair that's on your head. There's nothing that we could ever have done to earn that love, and he gives it to us freely. That is a choice to believe that or not, which is why I think that sometimes we have to lead with just the belief and the knowing, even if we don't feel it. If we wait for the feeling to come first and then the belief, I don't know that it ever will, because we don't have a frame of reference for that kind of unconditional love, of what that feels like. Even if you had the most loving family in the world, they cannot love you like God loved you. So even if you had healthy, secure attachment and upbringing and a family that was very, very loving and unconditional love, we still wouldn't have a frame of reference or what it might feel like to embrace and accept God's unconditional love. So I think it's okay that you didn't necessarily have that growing up and that you don't know what that feels like, because there is no other type of love that comes close to it. There is no other type of love that comes close to the way that God loves us. Sometimes at church, or at some churches, I'll hear them say, like, we love you and there's nothing you can do about it. And that is how God loves us. Even when we sin. And my preacher on Sunday was talking about how when we sin, it's not just that we're like breaking rules or we're breaking God's law, but it's that we're breaking God's heart. He is grieved when we are in sin, because when we're in sin, we're separated from him. God is grieved and heartbroken and sad when we're separated from him, because he loves us and he doesn't want there to be any separation in our relationship with him. There is nothing that we can do about the fact that God loves us unconditionally. If his love was conditional, he would have stopped loving me a long time ago. If his love was conditional, I would not be here at all. If his love was conditional, there's nothing that we could have ever done to earn God's love. And the beautiful thing, the grace and the mercy, is that there is nothing that we can do to lose it. Ooh, that got good to me. So if you are struggling with this concept of God's unconditional love, like with everything else, talk to him about it. Talk to God about it. Ask him to show you how much he loves you, or ask him to remind you, ask him to reveal it to you, and to help with your belief, because I think that's what it is. It's belief or it's unbelief, maybe, that it's possible to love unconditionally because you've never seen it. And if so many of your relationships had a lot of people pleasing in it, then they feel very fragile. And God's love is not fragile. It's not. So maybe ask him to heal that part of you and to help your unbelief, so that you can just truly embrace the unconditional love that he so freely gives us. God's love does not have any boundaries. I heard a sermon a while ago that said that God's love is reckless, because he loves us regardless of what we do and regardless of how many times we hurt him and sin against him. He loves us unconditionally. It is the biggest blessing. I really hope that this was helpful, and that helped you to feel God's love and to know his love. All right. That's all I have for you all. Thank you so much for being here and for listening. I love you, and I will see you soon. Thanks for listening to this episode of Therapy and Prayer. Thanks for listening to this episode of Therapy wherever you listen to podcasts. Make sure you're subscribed and following wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you want to submit a question to be answered on the show, send us an email at therapyandprayer@gmail.com. Send us an email at therapyandprayer@gmail.com. And make sure you're following us on TikTok. I'll talk to you soon. Thanks again for listening. I'll talk to you soon.